Good evening. My name is Jim Gierach, and welcome to the 9th edition of Chicago's War on Drugs. Today is Tuesday, May 30th, 2017, and we, of course, have just come off Chicago's Memorial Day. It's behind us, and regrettably, we have 7 people who have been killed and 52 people who have been wounded. Now, Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of the city of Chicago, and police superintendent Eddie Johnson attempted to tamp down that violence in anticipation of the typical Chicago Memorial Day violence. In short term, they did it by trying to put in place, and did put in place, some 1,300 extra police. And everyday Chicago violence they attempt to tap down by pushing for harsher penalties for repeat gun offenders. And many of our audience, I am sure, are sympathetic to that idea, especially if you're seeing the violence in your own particular neighborhood. But no one seems to be saying, let's talk about drug policy in order to reduce Chicago violence, the gangs and guns. Now, this past 9 weeks, this is the 9th week of 13 weeks, we have tried on Chicago's War on Drugs to bring you balanced opinions, people who favor the war on drugs and are opposed to it. And actually, it's really quite difficult these days to find people who are supportive of it because it's not really easily defended. We have invited Dr. Gary Slutkin, who is somewhat famous for creating Cure Violence and Cease Fire in Chicago and other cities. And it was his idea to treat violence as a disease. And Theo Hardiman, who was to be here last week with us, was, of course, the executive director of Cease Fire in Chicago. And the idea of this epidemiologist was that we should treat violence as a disease and try to cure the disease. And I was hoping to have him here so I could ask him, well, isn't really drug prohibition the disease and the violence simply a symptom? Well, when you see Dr. Slutkin, that's a question for him. I also tried to get Jack Riley, who was the number 3 man when he was in Chicago, head of the DEA, who's now moved to Washington, D.C., retired as the number 2 man, but who still gives speeches for the DEA. And he was not responsive to our request to discuss whether Chicago's war on drugs is really driven by drug prohibition. The U.S. Attorney's Office has not provided us with help to get a defender of the war on drugs. Our Senators Durbin and Duckworth, who of course are busy in D.C. and are often not here on Tuesday, but have not had the opportunity apparently to be able to say yes to come in and discuss drug policy. And the reason those 2 senators are so important is because they're the 2 citizens in Illinois that have the power and authority as U.S. senators to advise and consent with respect to treaties that the president has the fuller power with the advise and consent of the Senate. And therefore they have the power to do something about the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which is the mother of drug prohibition and the war on drugs in the United States, the Controlled Substances Act. But unfortunately, we won't hear from them, at least this round. Governor Rauner and his 4 opponents have been invited. And of course, Illinois has so many problems financially and otherwise, they're not here. But maybe part of the answer is for these candidates for governor and the governor is presently sitting, is to do something about drug policy. All of these people who are in positions of power, they are the ones who we need sitting at the table discussing should we be changing or amending drug policy. Rahm Emanuel has been invited, and thus far we have not been able to get a date scheduled. We have 3 more open dates, which I'm hoping we can hear from him. Police Superintendent Eddie Johnson, the former Superintendent Gary McCarthy, the new FOP Lodge President Kevin Graham have all been asked to be on the program to discuss, does drug prohibition make Chicago violence and the gangs and the shooting worse? Those questions should be answered. The heads of 2 Chicago trauma facilities, Trauma 1 facilities, were invited and not able to come either of their own volition or of the institution they work for. Jens Ludwig, head of the University of Chicago Crime Laboratory, has not seen fit to come on the show to discuss drug violence. The Reverends Jesse Jackson, Father Flager, Cardinal Supich, and Reverend Farrakhan have been invited. So we've tried to be inclusive, and if someone has something to say about this drug war that we suspect has something to do with Chicago violence, we wish they were here. Now, I should not be remiss and should let you know that we are here thanks to Azteca Baseball League. For 13 Tuesdays, we are being helped and sponsored by Azteca Baseball League at the website address and phone that you see. But back to business here. This is a call-in show. We welcome your calls at 312-738-1060. And tonight we do have a reverend who has shown up and who does want to talk about drug policy. This is Reverend Al Sharp, who has been with us once before, but there's so many things that he and his organization are doing. He's the executive director for Clergy for a New Drug Policy. So tonight is your chance to talk a little bit more.
I hear you said all these people that haven't come, and I'm saying, well, why am I here? And the answer is very clear. I respect what you're doing. I respect your perspective on the need to push back and end the war on drugs. So regardless of all these other invitations that didn't show, I'm delighted to be with you.
Yeah, and some of these aren't necessarily no's. Many of these, of course, are busy people, and as I said, like our U.S. senators have other things to do.
Yeah.
But it's really seems so fundamental and so much at the core of the things that Chicagoans and Cook Countyites and Illinoisans are complaining about. Americans, our war on drugs doesn't work. Now, what's your take on it?
Well, my take is that the war on drugs has failed, and when I think about the war on drugs, I think not just about the specific drug laws, but a broader culture of punishment which characterizes, I think, attitudes in this country. You see it in things that are related to the war on drugs. For example, the notion that you have a cash bail system, which means that if you're poor, you stay in jail for a nonviolent drug offense. If you have money to get out, and usually if you're white, you don't stay in jail. Something like civil asset forfeiture, where if you allegedly committed drug crime, your property can be seized and you have to sue to get that property back. You're guilty until proven innocent. That's part of a culture of punishment. All these things are related to the war on drugs, and we're pushing back on all the drug laws which we think are racist, which do not achieve their stated purposes, and then related issues like the ones that I've mentioned, like the terribly harsh sentencing policies that we have, calling for clemency when people clearly have served beyond any reasonable period of time. And I've tried to think what things we could change about our culture of punishment that would make a significant difference, and through the prism of the war on drugs, and that's what we're trying to do.
You mentioned the racial issues as it impacts the war on drugs, and I think there's been concern with Chicago policing, which is one of the reasons I was hopeful to get the FOP President Kevin Graham on to ask him whether he thinks that the war on drugs is really a contributor to the friction that exists between the citizenry on the one hand and our police and protectors on the other.
I don't see, and I'm surprised at how little serious consideration of that view that there is. Look, it's very hard to push back against the war on drugs because our general population makes it so hard for politicians who are afraid of appearing soft on crime. That's a death knell for a politician, even though there's so many things you could do that are reasonable and fair and just to change our drug laws without being soft on crime. It's rational to change some of these things, but if you do change, you are accused of being soft on crime. But just take the racial aspect which you've asked about. Drug use across races is approximately the same, and yet the disproportionate impact on African Americans and Hispanics of our drug laws is a terrible thing to think about. I mean, about 1 out of every 104 whites will be in jail at some point in their lives because of drug law offenses. That goes down to 1 out of every 34 for Hispanics, and 1 out of every 15 is in prison, I think, right now because of a drug law offense, even though drug use is equal across races.
Unfair.
Now, unfair? I mean, you can explain that to some extent because there's a concentration of police in poorer neighborhoods. But then you get into the question of why it's poor neighborhoods where you have most drug offenses. And then you have to begin to look at why are there some of these drug offenses. And some cases are simply crimes of poverty. People can't live, literally, without doing something that we don't support, but which we have to put in some kind of perspective.
You know, I think it was John Ehrlichman, who was the senior advisor to President Nixon, who had said that, well, we can't discriminate against people based on race, creed, color, or national origins, sexual orientation, and so forth. But if we can convict somebody of a crime, and if we make drug crimes a crime, the use of drugs, the voluntary, consensual adults using and selling drugs, it's a way we can go after the African Americans who are associated with using heroin, and it's a way we can go after the lefty liberals who are seen as the users of marijuana. Yeah. So we could have stories nightly on the news where these two groups are being vilified for violating this wonderful drug laws that we put in place.
Yeah, I usually don't introduce politics into these discussions about the need to end the war on drugs, but this is a case where I'm not at all apologetic for doing that. President Nixon knew exactly what he was doing. The fancy word would be conflating race and crime as part of a Southern strategy, as part of a strategy to get a vote which was upset by all the movements that were happening in the early 70s and to gain support generated by anger. He did bring together race and crime in a way that has been classically labeled the new Jim Crow by a wonderful author named Michelle Alexander. Sure. The first Jim Crow was slavery. The second Jim Crow was indeed the Jim Crow laws after the Civil War. The third Jim Crow was the war on drugs, nominally started by Richard Nixon in 1971 and then really ramped up on steroids by Governor Reagan, President Reagan, then Governor Reagan, in 1980 when he became president. So it is a form of Jim Crow in this country, and we simply have to recognize that.
Now, the thing that surprises me is that Chicagoans recognize that we've had this war on drugs going on for so long, and many of the African American leaders are really not out there beating the drums to say we need to end the war on drugs to stop this punishment and build it.
Increasingly they are. I mean, you can understand, there have been now PhD theses written on African American leaders in the 80s and 90s initially supporting the war on drugs. Famous Congressman Charlie Rangel was initially a proponent of the war on drugs. It's understandable if you think back to those days when, in fact, drugs were associated with violence. What wasn't realized is that the drug policies were doing more to promote that violence than the drugs were doing damage in and of themselves.
I remember Congressman Rangel, he was asked, he said, well, you want to legalize drugs. Well, how much heroin do you want to give them? You know, he was very, he was a powerful and able politician, but he put it in such a way, well, nobody wants anybody using heroin.
Yeah, but what one has to recognize is the distinction between drug use and drug abuse. Drug use is real. It's never going to go away. The question is how you respond to the abuse of drugs. And the answer is not prohibition, because that just pushes it underground, creates markets, which in turn compete, lead to gangs, and lead to the violence that you've really given a lifetime to opposing, whereas regulation, saying, okay, drugs are there, but let's make sure that if they are available, they're available in safe form, that we have education programs that explain more than prohibition ever can why we shouldn't use drugs in a way that is abusive. So regulation and education are the answer, not prohibition.
You know, the runaway violence that we have in Chicago is the thing that always amazes me as a former prosecutor here in Chicago. My mouse is running away from me. I'm trying to get a picture and it's not letting me. But the gist of it is that we have repetitive violence. We know that Memorial Day, we know that the summer, we know warmer weather is going to have the gangs out and selling drugs and shooting each other, and that our politicians are interested in putting in tougher penalties. For example, right now the legislature is considering harsher penalties for repeat offenders.
Yep.
And Rahm Emanuel has put this 1,300 additional police officers on the street. But this avoidance of the center core of what's wrong, prohibition, Al Capone style prohibition, United Nations style prohibition.
Yeah. Well, we should have learned from the 1920s, and we clearly haven't. And I think, for me at least, it goes back to the notion that if you do try to create reasonable legislation in response to drug use, you are going to be accused of being soft on crime, and so no politician is willing, or at least not enough politicians are willing to step forward and say, what does the evidence really show us? The war on drugs has not decreased drug use, it's increased arrests, and it has simply not achieved the goals for which it was stated. But it's very hard for politicians to come forward and say that. And that's why I try to reach out to people in churches and make the case, and I think you can make this as a matter of faith, that punishment is not the way to change hearts and minds. You change through persuasion, through understanding, through education, but you don't do it by locking people up. Think of it in this way. If someone's a recreational user, they shouldn't be in jail. If someone is an addict, the last place they should be is in jail. So what is the avenue to argue that by locking people up, by punishing them, if they're not hurting others? Obviously, we're not for drug trafficking, but what is the rational argument, apart from laws against trafficking, for the kind of punitive laws that we have now? There isn't a good answer to that.
Well, for some reason, we took zero tolerance and made it into a virtue, where historically tolerance is the virtue, not intolerance. And so we lock people up, even for marijuana. We have people spending their life in the United States in prison for marijuana.
Yeah.
Something that we now recognize in many cases is a medicine.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're going through a progression of changing marijuana laws in this country. You start with medical marijuana. 29 states now have medical marijuana as legal. Over half the population in this country lives in a state where medical marijuana is legal. I go back now to 5 or 6 years when we began the fight, or probably 7 or 8 years, to pass medical marijuana in Illinois. Everybody said the sky would fall. If a grandmother had medical marijuana, whatever form it was in her medicine cabinet, her grandchildren were going to turn to marijuana.
I see we have a caller who's probably about to report the sky is falling in, so let's go to our caller.
Thanks for taking my call. Great show.
Well, thank you.
Got one quick comment. First, it's good to see the church using reason to make decisions and choose platforms, because the premise of the church is one that is not rational. But it's good to see that change is beginning to take place. But the question I'd like to ask the father here is, how does the church intend to adapt to a world where one group of people cannot tell other groups of people how to live, specifically with gender, with sexual orientation with use of substances on this planet. Now, one last thing, it's called cannabis. Marijuana is a slang term. The name of the plant is cannabis, and there's two versions of it. So maybe you can answer those questions, and thanks for listening to my comments.
Well, thank you, caller. Appreciate it. Let's ask our guests. Reverend,
Well,
what do you say?
I live in two worlds. First of all, I should say you used the term father, and I respect the Catholic Church. Many friends, as I say, are Catholic. I'm actually a Protestant minister in the United Church of Christ, to be clear on my identification. I live in two worlds. I live in a public policy world. My initial training before divinity school was in public policy, and one sought rational solutions and does seek rational solutions to matters of public policy. But here I am bringing a faith perspective to this, and the question I think you're asking is, how do you reconcile the two? The thing that brings it together for me is we all have a moral obligation to be intelligent. If we have the best reasonable response, it seems to me we have the morally right response, because if it were an immoral response, it wouldn't be the rational response. So I really bring the two together and call. Nobody ever said if you have faith, you check your mind at the church door. So I think people of faith are called upon to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Both are part of the Great Commandment. And so, I like the phrase, we have a moral obligation to be intelligent, and that's what I call upon the church to do.
Well, oftentimes it seems like our prohibitions come from people who intend well.
Yes.
And are interested in trying to help one another. Well, we shouldn't have the guy spending his money on the booze or the cigarettes or whatever the sin may be.
And this is not to say that abuse isn't real. But the question isn't whether it's real or not. It's the question of how we reach hearts and minds of people who are struggling if they're in the throes of abuse or addiction. The Jesus that I know persuaded, he forgave, he preached a gospel of mercy, he preached a gospel of understanding, and he reached people's hearts by what he was and who he was. But he sure as heck didn't lock them up. The thing that made Jesus angry, as I read the New Testament, was a hypocrisy. So it's hypocrisy that we ought to be preaching against when it comes to drug policy.
We have presidents that have used marijuana and other drugs. We have Supreme Court judges who have used various illicit substances. We have people who are in upper echelons of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches who do the same thing that many of our people incarcerated are doing, which is two-faced, which destroys all value and sense of fairness and due process.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree with that. As your viewers probably know, our new Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, has declared again a renewed effort on the war on drugs, going back to the Reagan years of just say no. And what I would like to say to the Attorney General is, again, there's a distinction between drug use and drug abuse, and one has to focus on the latter, but not assume, as he does, that anybody who uses drugs is a bad person. That's ignorant, that's wrong, and ultimately it's not persuasive. It's not going to accomplish what he wants to say and what he wants to do. Nancy Reagan had a policy of just say no, not realizing how superficial that was. People who use drugs, for the most part, are people who are suffering stress, trauma. Of course, there's the casual drug user, and we don't want to encourage that, but not to acknowledge the deeper reasons why people have turned to drugs, and just assume, therefore, that punishment is the only answer is ignorant, it's wrong, and ultimately it's immoral.
I think one of the things that our viewers can do is, I sort of started the program out tonight talking about the people in positions of power who could have the opportunity to discuss these things and choose not to. But you, the citizens of Chicago, Illinois, and Cook County, have the right to talk to your elected officials, to your religious leaders, to the journalists who write for our newspapers, the Tribune and the Sun-Times, asking them what is their opinion regarding the war on drugs. Is there some policy that would be better in substitution for what we do now? And so really the power is in the people eventually to go to these people and say, we want these things discussed.
Yeah, and especially we need those voices from the communities that you don't necessarily hear them from. So many people are simply trying to protect what they have as opposed to real, and therefore using that as a justification for punitive laws, not realizing that those punitive laws are simply not serving any useful purpose, and they are destroying individual lives of those who are persecuted.
Well, I want to thank you again very much. We're going
pleasure.
to need to wrap up. It's funny how time flies when you're having fun. And it is enjoyable to have an opportunity to talk about these things candidly and openly and fairly and rationally to you viewers. And happily, a week from now, we're going to have the president of the Cook County Board, Tony Preckwinkle, joining us to talk about the war on drugs and its ramifications to Chicagoans regarding guns, gangs, crime, prisons, taxes, unaffordable government, health care, and so forth. So please join us again on Chicago's War on Drugs. I'm Jim Gierach, and good night.